welcome to this episode of Community Connections. I am your host, Anna Orr, and this is airing on OROMIA11. Today's guest is Jose Zayas Caban, and he'll be talking to us about Our Streets, Minneapolis. They have a couple of exciting events coming up in the Twin Cities to where you can get involved, and they're going to share some really important information about the work that's going on in our community, as well as what's going on with transit in the Twin Cities. This is going to be an episode you'll want to stay around for. Jose, I'm so excited to have you joining me today on this very special episode of Community Connections. Can you introduce yourself to our viewers and talk a little bit about your role with Our Streets Minneapolis?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I am the executive director at Our Streets Minneapolis, and so my role at the organization in part is to lead some of the high-level framing around the work that we do in the community. Obviously, there's always fund development to do for the organization, and to kind of be a positive presence and voice for the organization, and also advocate for the communities that we're always working with and partnering with.
Now, as a resident of Minneapolis, I'm familiar with Our Streets, but for those that may be watching this and don't really have a premise for Our Streets, can you talk about what you all do within the Twin Cities?
Yes, so the organization has had kind of an evolution over the last 10 to 12 years. Initially, it was the Bicycle Coalition, so it was much more heavily focused on making the city of Minneapolis friendlier to cyclists and developing infrastructure that made it possible for people to commute biking. And then from there, the Open Streets event series emerged from the organization, which is a very popular event series that brings in about 100,000 people via street closures and street festivals that kind of feature some of the unique highlights of different neighborhoods in and around the community. But since then, it evolved into Our Streets Minneapolis, and the mission and the focus of the organization has been not just for cycling, but also walking, biking, rolling, and transit. And we do advocacy at the city and county level to make sure that all modes of transportation are prioritized for community members who cannot afford to own cars, community members who have a disability, or people who want to choose not to drive because they understand that we're in a climate situation where we need to think about how we get around in relation to the kind of future we want to leave for our children. More recently, over the last couple of years, our work has evolved even more, and we have started to do a lot of work and gotten into research collaborations to understand the history of transportation infrastructure and how it has impacted primarily Black American communities and immigrant communities of color in and around the United States, and also the real estate development in the United States as it relates to how we basically made decisions in the past to specifically target these communities, destroy them, displace them, and how these cultural corridors were basically eliminated for the sake of segregation, for the sake of progress, and in particular the interstate system, which in the United States was uniquely built through primarily Black American communities. And so part of our work is to identify partnerships to uplift histories of neighborhoods that were lost to the highways, create community engagement and visioning opportunities for communities who still live along these highways to understand how they're still impacted by heat and climate emissions and pollutions, but also introduce ideas of what's possible, to basically make comparisons between these neighborhoods and the white American neighborhoods that have enjoyed generational wealth, that have never had to think about living next to a highway or the negative impacts of a highway. And ultimately, we advocate for highway conversions so that these neighborhoods that were sort of left behind in a state of harm in present day can get opportunities to think about communities that are reconnected, repaired, and restored, and ultimately gain access to the generational wealth that hasn't been afforded to them.
I think that's such important work. Oftentimes when we have people that are talking or may witness a news story about 35W or I-94, we don't necessarily think about the communities these areas are impacting. And I think Our Streets does a really good job in making that story, taking it from a headline and making it familiar and personal to the communities that it affects, because when we think about things like the light rail coming through a community, you think about access and opportunity, but you don't think about the grandparents or maybe the legacy family members that own homes in that area that are being affected.
I think that's right, and I think there are a few layers, and I appreciate you saying that about the importance of the work. There are layers that need to be uncovered and addressed, whether or not they're comfortable. One of them is that the decisions that were made in the past were done intentionally, that these communities were intentionally targeted because of the color of their skin or their economic status. And that's important because that tells us what is it that we need to address. Infrastructure alone doesn't tell the whole story. And so we always talk about people-centric approaches to advocacy, because really it's the stories of these people that create the framing that we need in order for us to do the work successfully, which is how do we want people to feel, and how do we want them to live, and what things do they deserve to have access to in order for them to thrive. And then that starts to really define our idea of what equity actually means. And so that's why we make these comparisons to areas where there haven't been impacts, where their racial covenants were used and they were protected, to basically say, look, we have communities that have enjoyed access to parks and lakes. They have easy access to clinics and grocery stores, employment and schools. They've never had to think about life expectancy or asthma hospitalization rates. They've never had to think about noise pollution or property values. And they've also never had to fear displacement or gentrification. And even more deeply than that, as someone who doesn't come from the mainland United States and someone who can sort of empathize with immigrant communities, there's a feeling of safety and cultural richness that I think is really important for us to work to preserve. And that adds value to the city as a whole, but needs to be done intentionally. And so infrastructure historically tells us that in the United States and in the state of Minnesota, it's a common held belief, and we've normalized this idea that people of color deserve a substandard of living. And so what we're trying to do as an organization is connect these history and these present-day stories so that people outside of these communities realize what's happening. People inside the communities are inspired to fight for more, so that we start to approach the work of infrastructure as affording people a quality of life that they've not been able to have or enjoy. Because if we believe in equity, and if we believe in racial justice, right, and if we believe in doing it in an honest way, then we need to aim for and try to achieve the highest quality of life, and therefore the point of comparison should be the highest quality of life that has been enjoyed by one ethnic group for several generations. And when we do that, then we can say it's not about transportation. Transportation can be a barrier or a conduit, but the end goal is re-empowering these communities and creating opportunities for them to thrive. And so I think we are always going to have more success if we rely on storytelling and we humanize the process.
I think that's very important. Can you talk to me a little bit about, now you shared a little bit about your own personal story in not being a traditional mainlander, but can you talk to me about your personal connection with the Twin Cities that led you to this type of work?
Yeah, so I actually have a background in music. But my connection to the Twin Cities first started when I came here to do my graduate studies in saxophone performance at the University of Minnesota. But fast forwarding to the end of my doctoral studies, I was encountered with the reality that Puerto Rico, where I'm from, was struck by 2 hurricanes, Irma and Maria. And the way the island was covered and the way the crisis was addressed obviously left the island sort of limping along. And I made a conscious decision to switch over the kind of programming that we did to focus on elevating voices from Puerto Rico and helping fundraise to bring aid to the island. And so I started to get into projects and performance projects that had to do more with social issues. The women's suffrage movement, for example, and then eventually we started to do work to focus on Puerto Rico. And so that started to get kind of my feet wet with dealing with nonprofit organizations and doing collaborations with local entities, highlighting social issues, doing community engagement. And then eventually I got into political organizing, started to develop these ideas of what kinds of things we could do intersectionally, sort of a very liberal arts mindset of like how can we bring different disciplines together to do the work. And I actually came to Minnesota as a recipient of the McKnight Artist Fellowship. And during the pandemic, I had a lot of time because I wasn't performing, and I started to get involved with organizing once again. And I met Alex Burns, who's our advocacy and policy manager now at Our Streets, and he encouraged me to apply to work at Our Streets. So I had these ideas of things that I wanted to do in organizing and engagement that I had developed through music and political organizing. And now I was in an organization that had an appetite to grow their advocacy program. And so I was just able to put them to work. And so you kind of see that in the work that we do now is that we have people in the organization that come from theater, they come from music, they come from biology, GIS, public history. They come from many different disciplines, and so that's how we approach transportation. We can bring a wide array of lenses, and it's also reflected in the partnerships that we have, that we don't just have partnerships in the transportation ecosystem, we have partnerships in labor and disabilities, in immigrant rights, in housing, and so our work is very multidisciplined. And then our engagement, we have Open Streets, which has now evolved even more into modeling of what communities can feel like when we center people. So even though the festival has been great for a decade plus, now when you go to Open Street, Cedar Riverside on Sunday, or West Broadway or Lindale, there's a much deeper and a more profound representation of the local community, and that's intentional, so that people get an idea of what it's like when we decentralize vehicle traffic and we recenter communities.
I think there is a really unique way of showing community when you all host Open Streets. If I had someone that was a transplant here and they said, I want to encounter the communities in a very local way, I would take them to Open Streets, because I feel like it's a way for you to meet your neighbors, but to also, like you said, really focus on the heartbeats of these areas, not necessarily how to get there and all the fast moving parts that kind of run through these communities. You get to kind of pause and really focus on the human interaction of things. Or not, if you choose just to enjoy the music or stroll around and eat or just look at it from afar. I feel like it takes the pressure off.
And I think that's a great point, because when we're talking about advocacy or visioning, we feel as an organization, I feel very strongly that one of the things that we've been able to do really well is that, to a certain degree, communities that have been devastated or oppressed, or just people who are really busy with the things that they do, they can't get activated around everything. But the best way to activate communities around outcomes is to show them how positive it can feel. So even though you're going through the event and you're going through the festival, same as if you come to a visioning session, we just did one where we met with community members and worked with Million Artist Movement and created a quilt. and people got to do little tiles for the quilts for things they would like to see instead of the highway. When you do activities like that that are positive, I think it drives people to get engaged even more. So sometimes, and this is something I learned in political organizing, that sometimes the message is, this is a bad thing, vote for me. And that kind of negative framing only gets people so far. They tend to run out of gas. But when you say, here's something positive, and here's what it can look like, and if you can get involved, you're going to benefit from it. So come to Open Streets, enjoy the event and the festival, but then get an idea of what a street can look like. Let's say if we did it permanently, which is totally possible. What if we close these streets down for the entire summer? Or what if we made them car-free permanently, long-term, like they're doing in other cities in the United States? You can have thousands of people walking down these corridors, businesses spilling over, and then the positive outcomes, of course, go further than just having a festival. It's like economies can grow from having car-free streets, because there's going to be more traffic, more people fit when we look beyond cars, and so there's going to be more spending. People who work in businesses oftentimes are the most transit-dependent members of the community. If they can get to the workplaces more easily, then employment and retention improves. People who don't have to spend on cars and they have other options, then they have cash available that they can spend locally. And of course, there's also the question of space. You know, our roads can take up to 80% of the land that we use. All of a sudden, when you take away vehicle traffic from corridors, the sky is the limit as to how you can rebuild and redevelop. And we know in Minneapolis, like in the Twin Cities and other parts of the country, we desperately need better, affordable, adequate housing opportunities, for example. So there's all of these greater benefits, but the way we introduce it to people is through positive visioning. And we make sure that they understand the connection between that positive idea and how they benefit. Now, you know, we've created something where I think that motivation can become self-sustaining. And that's the goal. That ultimately people can see themselves as part of the outcomes and benefiting from them. Then they'll definitely advocate for themselves and for their own communities, because they understand their connection to these ideas.
Absolutely. Now, talk to me about how you can be a part of Our Streets Minneapolis, because I know if anybody's feeling half as inspired as I am while we're sitting here talking, how can they connect if they want to be a part of not only the work, but also really put their hands to the grindstone, so to speak, in furthering this amazing work?
Great. So we have a website, ourstreetsmpls.org. Through there, I encourage people to engage with several different components. One is our advocacy work. So we do work along Olson Memorial Highway to convert that into 6th Avenue North, which was the very first avenue neighborhood that was destroyed to make way for a highway. We also do work around I-94. That campaign is called the Twin Cities Boulevard. And we engage in that effort to convert I-94 into a multimodal boulevard, but also reconnect all of the neighborhoods between St. Paul and Minneapolis, including the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, which is going to be featured at the Open Streets event. And also to come to Open Streets. The Open Streets in Cedar Riverside is on August 20th, and then I always forget the specific dates, but the one in West Broadway should be September 16th, and then Lindell is October 8th. And these events, you can also come engage with us. We're going to have an area there where you can see graphics of the highway's impacts, and you can see pictures of the different kinds of visions we're advocating for. But engage with our mobile history museums. So on Sunday, we're going to debut a new one that's called it's Concrete River Concrete, the Concrete River, and it's a history of I-94 in Cedar Riverside. And this one will talk about the Cedar Riverside neighborhood and how it was impacted by I-94. but it goes all the way back to the Dakotas. So the sort of the Native American communities are often forgotten in these processes, and it talks about the history of the University of Minnesota and intertwined, because a lot of people don't know that the university was segregated for a long time.
Can you just say that again for people that may not be paying attention to that?
Yes, community members in the Twin Cities don't know that the University of Minnesota was segregated, and more than that, their funding is built on an endowment that is paid for by stolen land. And so we're trying to do better work, because it is important to highlight the rich history and the harms to Black American communities here in the United States, but there's a deeper layer of Native communities and land that was used to fund the endowments that now pay for these land grant institutions that for a time were segregated. And the Cedar Riverside neighborhood was sort of the recipient of community members that couldn't live in other places because of racial covenants, because of redlining, but also because of segregationist practices. And even though the History Museum is more focused on the specific history of the neighborhood, it's something that's important to highlight, is that these high concentrations of Black American communities and immigrant communities of color were not an accident, that people just couldn't go live in other places. And even though we love the beauty of that neighborhood and how diverse it is, it was the result of intentional decisions and a lot of social pressures. And then at West Broadway, we'll have the Mobile History Museum about 6th Avenue North, where people can engage with that history. But the other thing is, in our advocacy page, there are always action steps people can take. And you just click and send an email, and relevant decision makers are going to get your thoughts about the work that we're doing. You can come to engagement events that we're doing as an organization, or just check in. We'll give you a chance to volunteer if you want to volunteer, or however you want to get involved. We're happy to help out.
I think that's wonderful. Now, we talked a little bit about open streets. I'm just going to ask you a couple logistical questions around open streets. Is it free and open to the public?
Yes.
And then you talked about one taking place on the 20th in Cedar Riverside. Where specifically in that area is it going to take place?
I actually don't know the endpoints off the top of my head, but basically we're going to have, I think it is about a mile, so it's like a half mile north of the Cedar Riverside intersection and about a half mile south. Ember could do a better job at this.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely, if you want to think of it, come and start there. Come to the Cedar Riverside intersection. It's going to be closed. I think it bumps up into Seven Corners, and I can't remember what the south end point is. And we're going to have, I think, 4 stages. Different from the other open streets events where we normally have a lot of street food vendors.
Mm-hmm.
We were specifically asked, and this is one of the nice things, each event has its own flavor, that the food will be the actual businesses on the corridor. So we're encouraging people to walk in and enjoy the diverse food in that area. And I think the war train, there's going to be a piece of it that's we're bringing it back. That's something that the West Bank Business Association wanted to do. And tons more things that I can't remember right now, which are all on the website. But it's August 20th, and then the events go from 11 to 5.
That was going to be my next question. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Now, outside of doing this amazing work for Open Streets, what else are you all at Our Streets Minneapolis working on?
Well, we're definitely, I should say we're also hoping that we can continue Open Streets in 2024. That's still kind of a question mark. It's up to the city of Minneapolis whether or not they want to continue to fund the program. We're hopeful that they will. And then beyond that, we do work for safety improvements on county and city streets to make sure that multimodal options are available, so better transit, and bike and walking and rolling options. And I am sure every community member who does not drive has experienced this. We advocate for a municipal plowing program here in Minneapolis. It's the most bizarre thing as someone who is not from here that it snows so much, but the city of Minneapolis does not afford pedestrians the ability to walk comfortably and access other modes of transportation. And so we're doing advocacy for that program to be citywide, for all city sidewalks and bike lanes and snowbanks to be cleared, because we have elderly people, we have people with disabilities, we have people who cannot afford to own cars, and we think it's an important equity issue. And we always tell folks, if you've not been to Montreal, I'm happy to tell you, we've talked to them, and some of our staff have been there. They have quite a larger population, much more mileage, and that city has been affording snow removal to their communities for their entire history. There's never been a time where a snowy city like Montreal has not cleared their sidewalks for people to move around. So we feel like
it is doable.
Yeah, exactly. It is doable, and we're far enough north where it is justified. And if you live in North Minneapolis, I know you do. I do too. In other communities, I experienced 6 months of frozen sidewalks, completely inaccessible. And I am able-bodied, but I see my neighbors all the time walking on the street.
It's true, which means that our minors are in the street as well.
Exactly. Parents with their kids trying to catch the bus, people in wheelchairs going uphill on 26, who, in really inclement conditions. Life would be much easier for a whole lot of people if we just cleared the sidewalks, and for folks who want to get around by bike or transit, if we cleared those snowbanks and those bike lanes as well.
I agree. Please provide us with the social media handles for Our Streets Minneapolis for those that are more digitally based and may not visit the website, but will say, if I'm scrolling, I want to keep up with what's going on with you all.
I believe for all of them is Our Streets Mpls.
Okay.
So you can find us on Twitter. I think we're on Blue Sky, TikTok. We're doing more stuff for the young folks. Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And, Carly, our communications manager, she does a great job of a range of content on all the platforms. So check us out on all of them. There's different things popping up in each of them.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Jose, for joining me and for sharing with our viewers the work of Our Streets Minneapolis.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. That is all the time that we have for this episode of Community Connections. As always, I am your host, Anna Orr, and I look forward to connecting again with you soon. A very special thank you to Jose and his amazing team at Our Streets Minneapolis. Please be sure that you participate in one of the September events or August events that are taking place with Open Streets Minneapolis.